All right, Fanon and colonial medicine. The transition from metropolitan, which is like, like cities in like France or like the United States, like New York and stuff, metropolitans. Transition from metropolitan France to the harsh realities of the colonies led Fanon to new preoccupations. An interest in academic dispute, like that with Benoni, gave way to the confrontation with the stubborn facts of the life, sanity, and death of the colonized. Fanon was soon struck with how Western medicine itself was readily used as an instrument of oppression. He subsequently presented a brilliant critique of Western medicine in his book, A Dying Colonialism, 1976. In that book, they talked about it. The book is a sociological and psychological masterpiece. It analyzes the Algerian Revolution, contains rare insights into domination of human transformation. There are several interrelated themes in Fanon's analysis of Western medicine in the colonial situation. Fanon explained how two contrasting world views, concepts of disease confronts each other within the Manichaean colonial arena. Even the doctor-patient relationship reveals the struggle between two irreconcilable protagonists in the colonies. Implicit in Fanon's view is also a rejection of glib explanations for the frequent failures of European health programs for the colonized. Most scholars trace the cause of such failures to problems in the indigenous societies. Some argue that health problems fail because the colonized maintain a rigid attachment to the indigenous culture. Others, baffled by the outright rejection of health programs, gave up the search for explanations for solutions. Fanon sought the answer in the colonized dialectic itself and insisted on the interesting principles. Quote, every time we do not understand a given problem in oppression, we must tell ourselves what we are at heart of the drama, end quote. In European societies, Fanon argued medicine is highly respected professions. The community accords doctors due regard and remunerations. Hospitals are too considered to be places of concern and compassion, institutions to care for the sick members of the community. They are a sanctioned refuge for those who in distress. Moreover, the doctor-patient relationship is considered sacrosanct. It is characterized by trust, confidence, and goodwill. The patient yields the privacy and integrity of his body to the hands of even the scalpel of his doctor. If inconvenience and pain increases in the course of treatment, the patient accepts this as a necessary step for a cure. The doctor's diagnosis, prognosis, and prescription are readily accepted in good faith. This trust and confidence of the patient also finds a happy complement in the doctor's ethical disposition and professional practices. The doctor listens, probes, and touches. The measures of empathetic tone of his word reassures and encourages the patient. He acts as a trusted ally of this patient and of potential patients in the community. What is more explicit, legal and professional ethics govern his social behavior and medical practice. They define the doctor's responsibility and the patient's rights. He cannot breach these legal and professional ethics and impunitive. We're going to look up that word. I've seen this word before, and it's used in lots of philosophical terms. We're going to look it up. It's hard to say it, but IMPUN. There it is.
Impunity.
No, it's right. Impunity, a legal and practical exemption for punishment, penalties, and negative consequences on other actions. So impunitive. Western medicine in a colonial society is, in contrast, quite integral to the prevailing system of economic, legal, and cultural exploitation. Though avowedly committed to ease pain, Western medicine partakes in the most tragic feature of the colonial situation. It intensifies rather than alleviates pain. Indeed, as we have shown earlier, the introduction of Western medicine in a colonial coincide with and facilitated the imposition of colonialism and racism. The doctor claiming to help helpless natives was as much a colonial pioneer as the missionary claiming to save heathens from hellfire. Often the two roles coincide in the same person. The doctor, always white, was also sometimes an army doctor. It is not surprising, therefore, that the colonized view the doctor's treatment, home visits, and sanitary improvements as an extension of the colonizer's intrusion that violates the integrity of the body, family, and community. His questions, statistics, and survey are seen only as covert forays to gain further spoils. His hospitals are not considered places of care and compassion. They are dreaded institutions to be visited when all else fails, and then only briefly and grudgingly. The colonized is keenly aware that the doctor and the policeman and the teacher are inextricably connected. The hospital and the prisons and the schools are viewed as variable institutions of colonial humiliation. The colonized quickly forget the differences in the ostensibly intend the function of these institutions. Their view of the oppressor is invariably indifferentiated and categorical. It so happens that a degree of assimilation or a serious and persistent illness brings a patient to the hospital. Even then, a striking ambivalence prevails. Cure itself only heightens the ambivalence. One is willy-nilly forced to choose between appreciating the curative innovations of Western civilization or retaining one's social culture nexus. Indeed, open acceptance of the colonizer's health innovation is easily misconstrued as wholesale endorsements of colonial oppression. Long ago, the colonizer convinced himself that the native could not exist without him. To admit the superiority of Western medicine is therefore to confirm the colonizer and his conviction. Either one accepts the medical innovation, and hence implicitly acquiesces to colonial humiliation, or one rejects the innovation and retains one's familial, cultural, and spiritual mores. In short, quote, the truth objectively expressed is constantly vitiated. Oh, I don't know this word. Vitiated. Let's make sure. V-I-T. I was really worried that I wasn't going to read too well today.
Vitiate.
Oh, vitiated, which is the spoils, impair, or invalidate the quality of legal effectiveness or something. All right. Vitiated by the lie of the colonial situation. Fanon's analysis was particularly original and unveiling in articulating the doctor-patient's relationship in the colonial situation. He elaborated how the perverse drama of the Manichaean world is played out even in the privacy of that relationship. The doctor and the patient, belonging to two irreconcilably species, simply reenact the colonizer-colonized dynamic in its crudest forms. The encounter between the doctor and the patient, which takes place at a moment of human distress, crystallized the veritable clash of two cultures and two groups of interests. Culturally, The encounter underscores a contrasting conception of disease, treatment, and even death itself. A mutual incomprehension is thus unavoidable. The doctor-patient relationship is also a dramatic microcosm of dynamics in the large society. The doctor is white, and the patient is a person of color. The doctor has power, and the patient has none. The doctor acts, and the patient is acted upon. The doctor is highly privileged, and the patient is downtrodden. The doctor is a fighter, in this case, ostensibly against disease. The patient is only a victim, now to disease, and always to the colonial system. The doctor is paternalistic, patronalistic, and accepts gratitude. The patient resents this and his condition of forced dependency. The doctor is convinced that life without him is impossible. The patient is amused by this and resorts to covert tactics of sabotage, even if this makes his illness worse. The visit to the doctor is always an ordeal to the colonized. Face to face with a doctor, the patient is often defendant. Yeah. He is at once facing a technician and a colonizer. If he speaks at all, he does so as oh my gosh, I don't know this word. A monosyllabus. I'm gonna look it up. Mono meaning one, I think. Mono, SYLLABLES.
Monosyllables.
Monosyllables, a word that consists of exactly one syllable. Monosyllables. His responses to inquiries regarding his ailments are too few and uninformative to suggest a diagnosis. The doctor grows impatient. He searches for other clues. He turns to the clinical examination, hoping to find the body more eloquent. But the patient's body is tense and rigid. His muscles are contracted, and the doctor's efforts are to no avail. Hence starts the vicious cycle of mutual suspicion, apprehension, and disparagement, so pervasive in the colonial situation. Fanon illustrates the point with the following remarks, and here's the remarks. The doctor: the pain in their case is protopathic, poorly differentiated, diffuse as in an animal. It is a general malaise rather than a localized pain. The patient: they ask me what is wrong with me, as if I were the doctor. They think they are smart, and they aren't even able to tell where I feel the pain. And the minute you come in, they say, they ask you, what is wrong with you? The doctor: those people are roughly and unmannerly. Patient: I don't trust them. Doctor: they don't know whether to stay sick or to be cured. With these people, you couldn't practice medicine. You had to be a veterinarian. Jesus Christ. The patient: I don't know how to get into their hospital, but I don't know how I'll get out, if I get out. So it so happens that such mutual incomprehension or distrust between doctor and patient does persist under the conditions of oppression. Serious doubts about the essential humanity of the other lingers throughout the encounter. Further contact only exacerbates the doubts into a categorical convention. The doctor, baffled and pressed, conjures up a hurry guess. His diagnoses the ailment and starts a course of action. If he recommends hospitalization, the patient feels doomed. His instincts prompt him towards fight or flight. A sudden death in the hospital signals relatives of deliberate murder, or relatives a deliberate murder. If the doctor offers only a prescription and an appointment, the patient considers this a momentous victory. He leaves the hospital in a rush and congratulates himself on a narrow escape. It often happens that the patient never returns on the appointed date, although the importance of keeping the appointment has been explained and re-explained. Now, if the patient shows up, he does so months later in the gravest, least irreversible stage of his illness. Moreover, an interview revealed that he did not take the prescribed medicine, or he may have taken it in according to the instruction. For instance, he may swallow a mouth supply in a single gulp in order, literally, to get even with it. More often, the patient takes the medicine and simultaneously visits an indigenous healer. Fanon explains the psychology of such a baffling subversion of Western medicine. If, for instance, the patient realized that penicillin is more effective, endorsement of its efficacy entails political, psychological, and self dilemmas. The patient becomes the battleground for opposing culture and political forces. Accepting Western medicine somehow validates the colonizer's techniques. Yet the press of his ailment forces the patient to try anything that may work. Thus, every pill or injection accepted must be complemented with the visit to the traditional healer. This simultaneous action is hoped to bring what Fanon calls the double power of the two therapies, and at the same time subvert the validity of Western medicine. Fanon in addition makes the important point that this predicament is being a battleground for opposing forces gives rise to stresses that affect the original ailment adversely. The problem of, oh my gosh, I got a warning already. Kiss my ass. The problem is not only the ambivalence forces of the colonized to view Western medicine through, hold on a second. Look at this, look at me. Okay. Let me see where I was at. Okay, the problem is not only the ambivalence forces the colonized to view Western medicine through, quote, the haze of organic confusion. The European doctor himself gives proof in word and action that he has an inordinate stake in colonial oppression. His privileged position requires that he callously defend and serve the system of oppression. Defend and serve the system of oppression. Soon after his arrival, he vies for control and is seized by a get-rich-quick mentality. He quickly becomes a landowner and attaches himself to the land. Moreover, colonial society imposes neither professional nor ethical codes on his practice. No governmental agency, professional association, or community organization safeguard the rights of patients. Medical practice in situations of oppression therefore becomes literally a system of piracy. The colonial Algeria, as Fanon explained, the colonized were used as guinea pigs. Sorry, everybody. Okay, sorry. For the most hideous experiments, French doctors produce epileptic fits in Algerian patients and African soldiers. These experimental studies were designed to estimate the specific threshold of the different races. The results of such experiments only serve to bolster racism and oppression. What is more, these experiments were combined with rampant fraud and clinical practice. For instance, twice distilled water was sold as penicillins. Vitamin B12 was sold to treat cancer. A doctor with no radiological equipment offered radiotherapy by simply placing the patient between a sheet for 15 to 20 minutes and subsequently collecting exuberant fees. Indeed, French doctors boasted about their knack for fraud when treating the colonized. They claimed to take x-rays with a vacuum cleaner. One doctor filled 3 different sized syringes with saline solution and sold them for 500, 1,000, or 1,500 francs. The patient equating quantity with high cost always choose the more expensive injection. This doctor was said to earn a handsome profit of 30,000 francs in a single morning. The colonial medicine that subjugated and plundered a defenseless people was clearly operative and in a privacy of doctor-patient relationship. The Hippocratic Oath aside, it takes a poverty of the heart and utter greed to mercilessly exploit humanity in distress and affliction. In reality, European physicians rarely acted otherwise in the colonies. The abuse of European doctors were not, of course, confined to harmful experiments and fraudulent practices. The physician himself was often a colonial agent. During the Algerian struggle for liberation, Fanon explained physicians constantly violated the principles of confidentiality. They reported the name of an element of the suspected nationalist, his address, and the names of his companions, and any other information deemed useful to colonial authorities. Physicians also readily compiled with the ban on medicine or treatment for wounded nationalists. If any inquiry as to the death or a tortured person was ever made, the doctor always vindicated the police and torturer with a certificate of natural death. Indeed, some doctors themselves, colonial agents, deliberately inflicted pain in defense of the colonial system. For just as they were properly owners, who in addition were doctors, so too did they readily become torturers who happened to be doctors, bringing their technical expertise to the practice of torturing nationalists. These were the nationalists they're talking about is the Algerian nationalists, the FLN. These people were fighting against colonialism and stuff like that. Nationalist. Fanon explains how French physicians used truth serums and electroshock for interrogations. The former technique involved the injections of a drug to produce loss of control and blunting the consciousness. Suspects given electroshocks were questioned. Then they were confused and off guard. Such doctors also collaborated with torturers to break a nationalist. Commonly, the doctor intervened during each session of torture to prepare the prisoners for yet another session. Quote, everything, fear stimulant, massive doses of vitamins is used before, during, and after the session to keep the nationalists hovering between life and death. 10 times the doctor intervenes. 10 times he gives the prisoner back to the pack of torturers. The result is often a dead prisoner, or else a, quote, personality in shreds. The surviving prisoner, now a patient, finds suspect all communications and human contact. Quote, months after the torture, the former prisoner hesitates to say his name, the town where he was born. Every question is first experienced as a repetition of the tortured, and relationship. Now, Fanon, when he was in Algeria, observed all these things, talked to both the torturee and the torturer. So, yeah. Scientific advancements are, of course, responsive to given needs and challenges. European historical needs has been to have more and more. The self-imposed challenge was to control others and make them less. To satisfy that historical greed, to fulfill the shameful missions, Europe employed all in its power: war, religion, deception, and of course science. The personal experience of and collective unconsciousness of the oppressed thus prompt to a fight-flight reaction whenever Europeans, including European scientists and physicians, are confronted. For some form of resistance, passive or active, becomes unavoidable and indeed necessary. As we will show in chapter 13, Fanon was convinced that science, depoliticized, is non-existence, but science in the service of people is indeed possible. And that's the end of that. We're on chapter 6. Anybody have any questions before I move on? Any questions? Because we're going to the master-slave paradigm. No questions. All right. Master-slave paradigms. The colonial world is a world cut into two. The dividing line, the frontiers, are shown by barracks and police stations. This world cut into two is inhabited by two different species, Fanon, wretched of the earth. Social oppression may indeed be a perennial scourge in human history. However, as we argued earlier, Europe's global conquest had fundamentally changed the character, scope, and intensity of oppression. We have already discussed how many Europe's greed for land and labor entail the occupation of continents and enslavement of millions and the unleashing of violence, leaving victims in every corner of the globe. We also sketch how an remarkable arsenal, gunpowder, alcohol, the Bible, and Eurocentric psychology has already been used in the historic mission for property acquisition and self-aggrandizement. This rampage has given rise to, in Fanon's word, the Manichaean world inhabited by different species, namely master and slave, colonizer and colonized, bourgeoisie and worker. In time, the occupation of land culminates in the occupation of psyches. This chapter examines three major paradigms of the slave-master dialect. Slave-master dialect, I think, was a Hegelian one. I'm not sure, but I think Hegel came out with it. First, it represents Hegel's influential ideas on the dynamics of bondage. These Hegelian ideas on the master-slave dialectic are both seminal and historic. Their impact on later formulations of oppression have been profound. Karl Marx, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Frantz Fanon, to mention only three giants, greatly benefited from Hegel's thoughts of bondage. Second, we present the idea of Monod, a French psychoanalyst, who offered a psychological controversial analysis of, quote, the colonial situation. We will see here not only Monod's remarkable originality, but also the pitfall of his perspective founding on both Eurocentrism and psychological reductionism. Third, we summarize Fanon's implicit paradigm regarding dialectics of white masters and black slaves. Though details of this paradigm are dispersed throughout the book, it is necessary to outline here how Fanon's contribution benefited and diverged from earlier formulations. Finally, the chapter concludes with a synthesis of a paradigm, the present or our own reformulation of the oppressor-oppressed dialectic. Hegel presented the details of his master-slave paradigm in the Phonology of the Mind. Full of insights and highly seminal, the work has had profound, far-reaching influence. Many thinkers, including Karl Marx and Jean-Paul Sartre, found in its ideas with which to understand, critique, and attempt to transform Europe. In particular, Hegel's discussion on the master-slave has since shaped intellectual discourse on oppression. The chapter dealing with master-slave is condensed, abstract, and I don't know this word. Elliptical, got it. But it is rich with ideas and suggestions, intriguing hypotheses on the origins of the dynamics of oppression. In a nutshell, Hegel argued that man becomes unconscious of himself only through recognition by the other. But when the desire for recognition is frustrated, there is a struggle, a conflict. He who attains recognition without reciprocating becomes the master. The other, who recognizes but is not recognized, becomes the slave. Not only does the master gain recognition, he also reduces the slave to a mere instrument of his will, a convenient means of fulfilling his needs. Yet these advantages only serve a limit of and compromise the master. Compromise the master. Alienated from human labor, the master loses the critical means of transforming his world and himself. The slave, however, works on objects and transforms them into his labor. The objects he transforms in turn crystallize and reflect his humanity. By transforming nature, he also transforms himself. Thus the slave, not the master, is in the end the real victor and the one who is self-actualized. The philosophical and intellectual language in which the Hegelian dialectic is couched obscures its rich psychological import. The interpretation of Hegel by Alexander Cauchy clarifies the original formulation and presents it in way more amenable to psychological conceptualization. Just gonna look back real quick. So, like, we're talking about the Hegel, the dialectics between Hegel, the master slave, and how we can transform that into a materialist look at things, and how it is being brought to today. Yeah, baby shark. Yeah, hello. This interpretation of Hegel by Kojève, can't say this, Kojève, was itself a monumentous achievement and highly influential. It was at the, oh my gosh, I can't say that, it's all in French. I'm gonna try it. École des Hautes Études between 1933 and 1939. What Cauchy presented a series of lectures on Hegel. Presents in his audience were Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Hippolyte, Lacan, and others within the significant intellectual elite of Europe. This intellectual elite and its subsequent contribution owes a considerable debt to Cauchy, I can't say his name, and his lecture on Hegel. Fanon too was indirectly influenced by the Cauchyian interpretation of Hegel by way of his discussion with Sartre. Because of its historical significance and psychological relevance, Cauchy's interpretation requires closer examination. The following is therefore a review of Hegel's master-slave dialectic as articulated, elaborated, and clarified by Cauchy. Self-consciousness differentiates man from animal. One is self-conscious insomuch as he is conscious of his identity, dignity, and human reality. Man alone attains self-consciousness. Animals have only a sentiment of self. Yet both self-consciousness and sentiment of self have a common origin in desire. This is so because biological reality always presupposes desire such as a desire to eat. Action itself is prompted by desire, not by contemplation or reflection. Indeed, cognition fosters, quote, passive quietude, desire and disquiets, and participates action. Action born of desire has a dual effect. On the one hand, it objectively destroys or at least transforms the desired object. On the other hand, it creates a subjective reality when the content of the alien desire's object is assimilated and internalized. Indeed, self-consciousness and sentiment of self are born of desire, but which of the two will emerge is determined by the type of desire and by the quality of the assimilated content. Animal desire, like the desire to eat, is bound to the immediate given reality and to preservation of life. It is desire directed towards the natural object. Assimilating the desired natural content, i.e. meat, produces only an animal I. A sentiment of self-consciousness is born of human desire, directed towards another human, namely the desire for recognition. This human desire goes beyond the immediate given reality and beyond the instinct of preservation of life. This desire entails risk of life for, quote, pure prestige and recognition. When human desire is directed towards another human desire, content of the internalized is neither a static nor a neutral object. Self-consciousness is therefore a dynamic, intentional becoming. Of course, the desire for recognition, the desire to have others affirm your values as theirs, presupposes that humans are fundamentally social. Recognition is possible only in the presence of confrontation of the other. This recognition by the other confirms one's self-worth, identity, and even humanity. Quote, it is only by being recognized by another, by many others, or, in the extreme, by all others, that a human being is really human, for himself as well as for others. Without recognition from others, that one believes and attributes to himself could simply be a delusion. The highest ideal, most authentic self-validation derives from mutual and reciprocal recognition. But such a reciprocity is too often unattainable without a struggle. For it so happened that some gain their humanity because of because they are recognized, where others lose their for lack of reciprocal recognition. This state of non-reciprocal recognition is what gives rise to the master-slave dialectics, being recognized and being unrecognized. That's what I'm getting. No reciprocal engagement, because the slave is, I'm assuming, it seems lower, so they're not recognized as a human. And the slave recognizes the owner and in their position, and the slave, I think. Well, look, a search of recognition necessarily entails a perilous struggle between two adversaries who want to force recognition from another. Oh my gosh, really? Come on now. Okay, I'm going to do this again. The search for recognition necessarily entails a perilous struggle between two adversaries who want to force recognition from another without reciprocating. The struggle that gives rise to the master-slave dialectic involves a fight to the death. But if both adversaries risk their lives and die, neither is recognized. If one alone dies and the other is deprived of recognition, thus for recognition to be possible, both adversaries must live. This can be so only if the adversary adopts two kinds of behaviors in the fight, one risking life till recognized, and the other submitting for fear of death. The one who is recognized but does not recognize becomes the master. So he doesn't recognize, but everybody else recognizes. Got it. The other who recognizes but is not recognized becomes the slave. The first adopts this principle, conquer or die. The second decides, become a slave and remain alive. Okay. Because the master is recognized, he is intersubjectively confirmed. His idea of himself and his self-worth are reflected back to him by recognition from the slave. See, the slave, okay. If he thus attains, quote, objective truth for what was to him subjective certainty. In contrast, the slave is not recognized and thus lacks both objective confirmation and subjective certainty of his human worth. The master elevates himself and is elevated to human life. The slave is reduced himself to animal life because he's not recognized as a human being. The first reveals himself as an autonomous, determining consciousness. The second becomes dependent, determined consciousness. That's the slave. The master not only attains recognition from the slave, but he also consumes and enjoys what the latter produces. The slave thus becomes only an extension of the master's will and body. Herein lies the foundation of human oppression. Yet this master-slave relationship also entails a hidden tragedy of the master and the promising future for the slave, where sooner or later the master finds himself in an existential impasse, quote unquote, the recognition of which he risks his life proves to have two authentic values. This becomes clear upon considering why in the first place the master engaged in the fight and the disappointing way in which the victory concludes. Before the fight, the master was an autonomous person seeking validation through other recognition. After the fight, the master attained recognition from one whom he made less human, merely an animal or a thing. What initially participates the fight was a human desire directed to another human desire. Now it has become a desire directed to a slave, a thing, or an animal. The master is therefore recognized by a mere thing or an animal. The recognition he obtains is inauthentic because he is recognized by someone not worthy. Finding he is on the, quote, wrong track. He is never satisfied. Thus the master is a prisoner in the situation of his own making. Yet in spite of his tragic predicament, the master lacks the will and wish to change himself or to get out of his existential rut. So without the slave, the master is not recognized, is not validated. Nor can he be educated, convinced, or rehabilitated. He is too accustomed to being master. He is fixed in the status of master and views mastery as a supreme value, the cherished goal, idle and unproductive, comfortable and mere consumption. He finds little motivation to change himself in this way. He clings to his principle of conquering or die, being either a master or a slave. Now, if he cannot change on his own, if he can neither be educated nor rehabilitated, there remains only one way to overcome the master-slave relations. The master can be killed. For the master to be killed, for the master-slave relation to end, the slave too must cease to be a slave. He must somehow rediscover his lost humanity and fashion it to his image. His experience in slavery was full of torment and sacrifice. But these torments and sacrifices actually gave him a decisive edge and a substantial advantage. He alone is destined for authentic recognition and satisfaction, unlike the master who is fixed and imprisoned in the situation of his making. The slave is the embodiment of change and is ready to transcend the oppressive situation he finds himself in. Slavery eroded every stable anchor for him. Nothing is fixed, but the fight he did not risk his life for freedom. Now as a slave, he knows what it is to be free. Knowing that he is not free, he wants to become free, change which the master dreads, the slave desires by any means. Indeed, quote, if idle master is a impasse, laborious slavery, in contrast, is the source of all human, social, historical progress. History is the history of the working slave. The slave has thus every reason to overcome slavery, to overcome his bondage. He first overcomes his fear of death and embraces liberating work. Originally, he became a slave because he did not risk his life for recognition and freedom. Having become a slave, his fear of death persisted and was incarnated in his person in the person of the master. This constantly lived fear shook him to his foundation. Quote, by this fear, the slavish consciousness melted internally. It shuddered deeply, and everything fixed or stable trembled in it. Later, however, this fear of death, the fear of the master, is demystified. It can no longer overwhelm him or enslave him. Indeed, this fear educates the slave and gives him new ideals for which he can now risk life, which is now a wretched life. He who knows he cannot escape death or overcome the fear of death is potentially a revolutionary. But before the slave imposes himself on the master, he reconstitutes the transformation himself through work. The work the slave performs was imposed on him by the master. This imposed work nevertheless creates for him new possibilities. It frees him from being a slave, first of nature and later of his master. In the first fight, he refuses to risk his life. He submitted to the imperatives of the natural instincts, the instincts of preservation. He thus chose to remain a slave of nature, a slave of nature. He also became a slave of the master. But through work, the slave frees himself from nature and his master. Work for the slave requires that he repress, quote unquote, the desire to consume. He accepts a delay in gratification. Thus he supplements and transcends the immediate through work. Work also educates him and permits him to transform things as well as himself. His work creates a non-natural world, a cultural, historical, human world. Through work, the product of his labor, the slave objectifies himself, his personality, his humanity. Quote, the product of the work is, quote, the realization of his project and of his ideas. Hence, it is he that is realized in and by the product. It is by work and only by work alone that man realizes himself objectively as man, and only in his real and objective product does he become truly unconscious of his subjective human reality. Interesting, right? Interesting, huh? Interesting. Whereas the slave is thus an objectified history. The master is only the catalyst of this historical process. Without the master who imposes bondage and work on the slave, this historical process, this objectification of personality and history would not have taken place. The master imposed work through terror. He consumes the product of work while requiring the slave to delay gratification of his needs. The master consumes behavior require more work, more discipline, more production from the slave. It is this imposition of work, discipline, and production that nonetheless creates the condition in which the slave transforms his world and himself. By transforming his world and himself, the slave puts his objective world in harmony with his subjective experiences. A harmony the master cannot obtain. And the slave overcomes terror and engages in liberating work. He once again takes up the fight for recognition. In the end, the slave succeeds where the master failed. The slave alone attains authentic self-consciousness and objectifies history. In short, the slave embodies the future of human history. The warlike master is simply a catalyst who must perish. The master-slave dialect is thus the dialectic of history. This interpretation of the master-slave dialectic at once clarifies and extends Hegel's original formulation. How much is Hegel's and how much Cové's is a matter for debate. But there is no doubt that the Covéian interpretation of the master-slave dialectic has been influential and is rich in psychosocial import. Covey integration of Hegel and Heidegger influenced both Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. His views on the role of desire and speech have also been pivotal in the psychoanalytic contribution of Jacques Lacan. Indeed, Sartre's perspective on desire and action has the same origins, namely Covey's and Hegel. A human being for Sartre is a being in need. This world of scarcity conditions in an incessant struggle to meet needs, to fill a void, the need for food, sex, shelter, and recognition from the other stirring men, and material production, the action towards the other. The central notion of Sartre bears clear Covian influences. It's significant that Covey has been criticized for the overtly social interpretation, quote unquote, of Hegel's master-slave dialectic. George A. Kelly, for instance, argues that Covey exegesis ignores. I'm gonna look at that word real quick, because that's like the third time I've seen that word, and I remember looking at it before, but I don't remember what it was about, because my brain doesn't like to hold freaking definitions in their head. Here it is.
Exegesis.
Exegesis, a critical explanation or interpretation of a written text. Exegesis ignores, quote, the subjectivities of the scenario, end quote, and unduly rejects, quote, the anachronistic overtones of the Marxian class struggle, end quote. Kelly purports that Hegel's master-slave dialectics is primarily a metaphor for inherent traits of domination and servitude within individual psyches. He concedes that Hegel broached the social and interpersonal dimensions more explicitly. Nevertheless, Kelly understands Hegel to mean that the social and interpersonal expressions of the dialectic are derivatives of more basic psychological traits of mastery and slavery. Kelly argues that the master-slave dialect originates in, quote, the natural inequities, end quote, and, quote, internal imbalance, end quote. How else, Kelly asks, we can explain why the two protagonists locked in combat and one becomes master and the other slave? Unfortunately, Kelly does not explain what he really means by, quote, natural inequities and internal imbalance. But one thing is clear in his argument, the oppressed is held responsibly for his oppression. He who enslaves conquers. Oh my gosh, another visible one? Come on. And conquers and colonizes is explicitly vindicated. Kelly finds support for his contention on the following quote from Hegel. Here's what it is. If a man is a slave, his own will is responsible for his slavery, which just as it is its will which is responsible if people is subjugated. Hence the wrong of slavery lies at the door, not simply of enslavers or conquerors, but of the slaves and the conquered themselves. So they're saying that the transformation, the historical transformation, the historical subject is, oh my God, hold on. Oh, come on. I'm trying to do this puzzle piece and I keep there we go. So like what they're saying is that basically we, anybody who's oppressed have the tools and the ways of like destroying that dialectic, destroying the oppression. Just like Marx, I don't know, Marx or someone said that, like, basically the proletariat is the grave diggers of the bourgeois capitalist society because they have the tools for their destruction. Our intent here is not to join the debate on what Hegel really said or meant. Rather, we wish to emphasize that maneuvers to blame victims of oppression are time-worn efforts to both rationalize an injustice social order and to assuage a guilty conscience. As we have seen in earlier chapters, such maneuvers abound in the psychological literature. What is remarkable is that victim blamers never put the onus on the initiators, the maintainers, and initial beneficiaries of oppression, namely the oppressors themselves. Of course, and you see that with us. You see that, like, when you talk about poor people and everything in our society, they blame us. They do the victim blaming. That's why victim blaming is never pointed to the people that are perpetuating it. It's pointed to us who are being, the psychological, and that's just like, just with classism, not with the oppression and colonialism, you know what I mean? The psychological preconditions of oppression no doubt needs further study, but resorting to immutable group characteristics or racial differences leads only to the solipsism and racism we discussed earlier. Contrary to Kelly's claims, The Kovanian interpretation is pregnant with many psychological insights, as shown by its formative influence in Lacan's psychological thoughts. Fanon's version of the master-slave dialectics, in particular, avoids the pitfall of genetic and psychological reductionism. Moreover, Fanon situates the mythical master-slave of Hegel in a lived historical drama in which the disaster and inhumanity one led to the disaster of inhumanity of the other. Any question before we move on to Menones' master slave? Any questions?
I don't.
Anybody have any questions? You have a question?
No, I said I don't have any questions so far.
Oh, okay. All right, sounds good.
Understanding.
All right. Okay. Menones' master and slave. It can be recalled that Menone proposed two psychological complexities to explain the origins of the dynamics of colonialism. His proposition of inferiority complex on the one hand and dependency complex on the other informed the conceptual edifice of his analysis. In his effort to understand and analyze the colonial situation, Menone attributed a basic inferiority complex to the European and a basic dependency complex to the colonized. Though Menones' analysis focused particularly on the Malagasy he studied, he argues that these two complexities underline colonial domination in general. Moreover, he assumes that the two complexities predated colonialism and have long existed in the collective psyche of the two groups. Fanon critique of Menone regarding the attribution of the dependency complex to the colonized has been discussed in chapter 5. Yet in spite of its serious limitations, Menone's work has some heuristic values in the exploration of the psychological of oppression. Of particular interest, here is how Menone arrived at the two basic complexities and how he used them to analyze the colonial situation. Even though Menone may have erred in his analysis of the colonized, one thing is certain: he approached the psychology of oppression with a courage and commitment rare in psychological literature. What Kelly and others of his persuasion had obliquely suggested or groped for with such ambiguous terms as, quote, internal imbalance, Menone presented with unusual boldness and detail. He offered in his own theory on the psychological preconditions of colonialism, though his assumptions and conclusions illustrate the pitfall of psychological reductionism and Eurocentrism. His method of analyzing the collective unconscious is indeed valuable. Menone's ideas on the colonial situation therefore deserves more consideration than either Fanon or our previous discussion gave it. The title of Menone's book, Prosper and Caliban, is itself revealing. Prosperio and Caliban are two central characters in Shakespeare's popular play, The Tempest. This is the story, the human drama of shipwrecked travelers who find their way to an enchanted remote island inhabited by alien and developed people whose humanity is in question. Prosperio, the Duke of Milan, comes to preside over life on the island, though an incompetent Duke of Milan and with little promise of accession to power on his return. Prosperio attains power, authority, and a measure of respectability on the island. He dominates the action of the play, commands people as well as spirits, and is depicted as a benevolent ruler. Significant, he uses white and not black magic. He has the power to create and subduing storms. He asserts his will on others, and with varying degrees of success, foresees and controls their actions. He is a symbol of reason, knowledge, and authority. He educates, protects, and commands. In short, his characterization resembles the self-perception and practices of the European colonizer who ventures to distant lands and usurps power. Caliban is an islander. The shipwrecked party meet, enslaved, and domesticate. He is said to be the son of the devil and a witch. He resembles a monster, a hybrid of man and beast. He possesses little mental capacity beyond an inability to acquire practical education. Pizarro taught him language, at least European language, and expects of him devoted service and complete obedience. You know what? If you just approved it, why do I have to say okay? You know what I mean? Why? His name is an anagram for cannibal, quote unquote, even though there is in fact no indication of his being one. He is a servant who must attend to the needs and wishes of alien intruders. Shakespeare calls him, quote, this thing of darkness, end quote, which Pizarro detests and describes his function thus, quote, he does not make our fire, fetch in our wood, and serves in offices that profit us. Caliban is despised, cascaded, and ordered around by the intruders who now claim his island. Caliban, of course, resents his mistreatment and yearns for freedom, yet he is portrayed as one who neither comprehends the meaning of freedom nor possesses noble equalities. He is poetic and affected by music, but he also embodies urges that are primitive and hedonistic. I'm gonna look up that word. I'm gonna put like something like hedons or something, or let's find out. Hedonistic. Hedonistic. Yeah. The lifestyle, behavior, or philosophy entirely devoted on pursuing the pleasures of self-gratification. Hedonistic. He consumes ambition is to kill I can't say this guy's name, Prosperio, and rape his daughter, Mirandia, who symbolizes beauty, innocence, and chastity. In effect, Caliban presents the enslaved, exploited, and dehumanized, on whom are projected all and unacceptable impulses of the repressors. Benoni was long preoccupied with efforts to comprehend the origins and dynamics of the colonial situation. He was particularly intrigued with why Europeans ventured as far so previously. The search for answers prompted him first to undertake his own psychoanalysis, and then to observe behavior in the colonial situation. He also analyzed the projective content of dreams and folklores of the colonized, with the intent to delineating the psychological determinants of colonialism. His analysis combines psychoanalytic perspectives, Alderian notions, and complex and composition. The Jungian concept of archetype and the collective unconsciousness, though he concedes the importance of economic and political consideration. Benoni gave premise to the psychological determinants of colonialism. In his view, economic dominance and political rule become reality only for those who in the first place are, quote, psychologically prepared for such eventualities. According to him, the Europeans and the colonized were psychologically conditioned for colonial relations long before colonization occurred. That's bullshit. Colonial situation in Benoni's field is above all the encounter of two different personality types. By personality, he meant the sum total of beliefs, habits, and propensities that make the individual a member of his group. Underlying this contention was the assumption that each culture or civilization foster a typical personality structure that is passed on from one generation to the next. This typical personality structure was said to constitute the psychological heredity that represents the crystallization of individual families and groups experiences within a history and an environment. The complexes of inferiority and dependency consider two fundamental and mutual exclusive alternatives, form the axis upon which personality and culture developed. Each is believed to be nodule, but repressed. There is one prevail. Where one prevails, the other is thought to be non-existent, or at most potential. Each is conceived to underline a particular form of mentality and civilization. Jesus Christ. Just like, why I'm appealing the same thing. Just stop doing it. One is considered to engender higher development of personality and culture. The other, socioeconomic and technological stagnation. One is seen to foster dominance and the need to rule, and the other to condition submission and the need to be ruled. To support his thesis of the dependence complex, Benoni relied on his analysis of the Malagasy behavior, folklore, and dreams. Among the Malagasy he encountered, he found a marked prevalence of, quote, dependent behavior. A favor done once is said to be taken for granted without gratitude by the Malagasys. What is more, this favor is viewed as a license for expecting more favors from the Europeans. In such behavior, Benoni finds clear evidence for a deep-seated dependency. Quote, in fact, gifts, which the Malagasy first accepts, then ask for the final, and finally, even demands, are simply the outward and visible signs of this reassuring relationship of dependency, end quote. The absence of gratitude is also seen as further manifestations of the dependency Benoni viewed as an enduring and essential component to the personality of the quote-unquote native. Feelings of gratitude presuppose a weakening in the bond of dependency, a weakening that the native allegedly avoids. And since gratitude can exist only among persons who are equal and autonomous, it is considered simply futile to expect gratitude from the dependent Malagasy. According to Benoni, he's an idiot. He's a bad person. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that word. According to Benoni, the dependency complex of the Malagasy is not confined to individual behavior. It is also deeply entrenched in the collective unconsciousness. So he's saying they wanted it without knowing. Oh my God. Benoni found evidence of this in what he called the, quote, cult of the dead, and also in his analysis of Malagasy's dreams. He viewed ancestors. Now remember when they said that when he viewed the dreams, he was out. He didn't analyze them correctly. His analysis was horrible. He viewed ancestors' worships as a key to the collective unconsciousness of the Malagasy. The belief in the power of dead ancestors permeated everyday life and was clung to with remarkable tenacity. Life, peace, and fertility were all explained in terms of their omnipresence, wishes, and influences. For the Malagasy, the dead ancestors are the sole and inexhaustible fount of all good things. They are the originators of custom, the pillars of life in the family, as well as in the community, and God of the universe. The living are nothing but their deputies. What power and authority the living fathers claim derive from the dead ancestors, whose will and wishes are inferred from dreams, portents, and prophecies. Indeed, the cult of the dead is said to be so firmly lodged in the personality and collective unconsciousness of the Malagasy as to be impervious to logic, rationality, or science. Even conversion to Christianity has not, according to Mannone, shaken the foundations of which ancestor worship and the dependent personality structures are found. Conversion to Christianity only becomes a social mask, and as Mannone would have it, the mask is adopted readily enough, but beneath it there subsists an anarchic type of personality found not upon the belief in the remote eternal Father, but upon the nearer and much more powerful image of earthly fathers who have died. Mannone viewed the dependency complex of the Malagasy as an anarchic childhood fixation that, quote, only the West has the courage, end quote, to outgrow. More bluntly, the Malagasy are seen to be children who lack the courage, desire, or temperament to grow to mature adulthood. Not even the ripening adolescence. Child rearing practices, particularly the Malagasy practice in the indulgent breastfeeding and delayed weaning, are seen as perpetuating a dependency complex. This pattern of dependency in which the individual Malagasy is believed to be entrenched is also seen to characterize the Malagasy culture, behavior, and collective unconsciousness. Moreover, Mannone considered the threat of abandonment the greatest threat the Malagasy individual and community could conceive of. Jesus Christ, this guy sucks. Having reasons that growth to adulthood entails an, quote, orphan state, end quote, in which parental nurturance and authority are outgrown. Mannone asserts that, quote, the non-civilized man, end quote, is without doubt, quote, the totally unfit, end quote, for a pattern of life without absolute authority and hence need colonial domination to satisfy his naturally infantile needs. Mannone sucks. Mannone's horrible. I don't like Mannone. Once the trickling down of the ethnocentrism bursts, Mannone takes a predictable course. Rebellion and national liberation struggles are interpreted in terms of the dependency complex and of the threat of abandonment. The Malagasy personality and collective unconsciousness are said to be incompatible with national dependencies. Thus, what appears as a genuine struggle for freedom is said to be only a reaction to frustrated dependency, needs, or the threat of abandonment. Of course I win my thing, because you guys... Jesus Christ. What is more, the Malagasy are said to have been psychologically prepared for colonial rule long before European colonizers arrived on the shores of Madagascar. Indeed, from the analysis of several dreams in the limited forange in ethnographic literature, all on the Malagasy, the conclusions is that all colonized people have anticipated, desired, and readily submitted to colonial rule. Quote, whenever Europeans have founded colonies of the type we are considered, it can safely be said that their coming was unconsciously unexpected, even desired by the future subject peoples. Bullshit. They were just nice. They just accepted you, and you were just like, oh, we can take advantage of these people. In contrast to the dependency complex of the colonized, the inferiority complex is said to characterize the European personality, the collective unconsciousness. In fact, the struggle with the feeling of inferiority is assumed to be the primary stimulus for the more advanced psychocultural and technological development of Europeans. The inferiority complex constitutes, in Mannone's words, quote, the main driving force of Western man and provides him with the energy which sets him apart from all other peoples in the world, end quote. The struggle with this complex is considered to underline European initiative, independence, creativity, and dominance. Mannone attempts to distinguish this inferior complex of the European from the inferiority complex that arises as the result of a devalued skin color or in minority status. The The former he suggests to be a fundamental trait to the European, something rooted in the history of collective unconsciousness. The later he reviewed to be superficial, transient, and a mere reaction to social disadvantages. In Mannoni's view, social inequality is not necessarily the cause of inferiority complex. And the inferiority complex in itself could not have led to colonization of distant people. According to Mannoni, there had to be another trait equally fundamental to the European personality, structure, and collective unconsciousness. Yes, it's called, they were like capitalists in one. Okay, anyways. Real quick, I'm going to put a bookmark here. 126. Just going to look ahead. Thus. Just looking ahead. Okay, there, I found a stopping spot. We're going to probably stop there. Okay, thus, Mannoni proposes that behind the European need to rule people in distant lands where there existed both the inferiority complex and the trait he called misanthropy. Misanthropy. The first refers to the basic feelings of inadequacy. The second, a basic mistrust and hatred of mankind. Mannoni argues that these two traits, an inferiority complex and misanthropy, constitutes the driving force of European colonialism. Both traits are repressed, but they nonetheless find expression in the behavior of the European. The inferiority complex is defended against through compensatory efforts to dominate others, patronize them, and be superior to them. The misanthropy is expressed in flights from people and impels thousands of Europeans to travel to distant lands. Mannoni argues that the inferiority complex and quote, the lure of the world without men are more potent motivations than the wish to earn profits. And here's what he said. The, quote, colonial is not looking for profit only. He is also greedy for certain other psychological satisfactions. And that is much more dangerous. Accurate observation of the fact would not doubt show us that he very often sacrifices profit for the sake of these satisfactions. That's what Mannoni says. And they're talking about the actual colonizers. To corroborate his thesis of inferiority complex and misanthropy in European, Mannoni found proof in certain recurrent themes of popular European literature. He argues that the same basic traits underline major characters in such works as the Tempest, Robinson Crusoe, and Gulliver Travels. These works often recount the stories of shipwrecked, lost, or exiled Europeans who become heroes, display exceptional virility and technical ingenuity, and flaunt the superior qualities of their nature or culture. The natives they encounter in distant lands are depicted as subhumans, semi-human, or at least immature people who are easily outwitted, used for advantage, and patronized. Mannoni contends that the traits of inferiority and misanthropy have characterized the European psyche as early as 1572, and certainly before colonialism. He further argues that Shakespeare and Defoe, for instance, had no models of Prospero or Crusoe other than their own personalities, which exemplify European character structure. He also indicated that such literary works have lasted and have wide appeal to Europeans because they strike a chord in readers and veracity. Oh, I don't know this word. Vicariously. I think it's vicariously. We'll find out. Vicariously. Is that it? That's it. Come on.
vicariously.
Yes, I got it right. Vicariously gratified shared needs. These works offered imaginary characters of whom are projected feelings, thoughts, and fantasies salient to European psychology. Benoni traces the origins of such an inferiority complex and misanthropy to childhood and cultural conflicts of the European. Both traits are said to derive from deep-seated sexual guilt, potential prohibitions, and an intense need to project unacceptable impulses on others. In the inferiority complex is the impetus for the development. It is also what sets the European psyche in a state of war with itself and with others. Misanthropy entails a wish for the world emptied of human beings as they really are. The flight to distant lands fulfills the need that requires massive dehumanization and projection. The inhabitants of these lands are thus treated as if they were Caliban or Lilliputans. Either they are seen as monstrous and terrifying creatures, or be brutally subdued, or considered as, quote, gracious beings bereft of will and purposes, and hence readily patronalized. In either case, the unconscious misanthropy drives Europeans to distant lands and dictates a familiar course of action. Benoni says, the same unconscious tendency has impelled thousands of Europeans to seek out oceanic islands inhabited only by Fridays, and alternatively to go and entrench themselves in isolated outposts in hostile countries where they could repulse by force of arms those terrifying creatures whose image was formed in their unconscious. Jesus Christ. I hate this dude. I don't like him. Once the colonies and have an usurped power, the Europeans use these inferior beings, quote unquote, as convenient scapegoats on whom are projected the evil intentions of the European. Prosperio is thus readily resuscitated, and the colonized, treated as Caliban, are imputed with the beastly urge to grape one's daughter or sisters or the neighbor's wife. But what is imputed to the colonized are the very impulses and fantasies inherited to the colonizers. The indictment of the colonized in mass is simply a defensive maneuver against fundamental conflicts in the European. The more intense these conflicts, the more often racism rears its ugly head. Europeans and the colonies codified their views to Benoni. Most not only assumed the racial inferiority of black people, but some also explain this to be a consequence of excessive masturbation. Jesus Christ. The assumption of explanation only demonstrates the perversity underlining colonialism and racism. The colonized are, of course, resented whenever they assert personhood, most of all when they claim the rights to freedom. In both instances, the colonizer feels outrage, and he knows more is at stake than economic or political domination. Also threatened is a psychological status quo of projection, and exploitation, which he defends relentlessly and viciously. Benoni writes, in other words, we are perfectly happy if we can project fantasies of our own unconscious on the outside world. But if we suddenly find these creatures are not pure projections, but real beings with claims of liberty, we consider it outrageous. However modest their claims. Further, it is not their claims themselves which makes us indignant, but the very desire for freedom. Racialism, properly speaking, is simply a rather poor rationalization of feelings and of indignation. And yet Benoni, this is back to the text, and yet Benoni, with all his bold insights, flounders most in reverence to the dilemma of the colonizer. When he confronts the question of national independency for the Malagasy, his thesis of a basic dependency complex and a threat of abandonment both presume to predate colonialism, override all considerations. It is a claim that the Malagasy transferred their basic feelings of independence to the colonizer, who himself has a need to dominate, infantilize, and patronize. Monone himself actually infantilized and patronized the Malagasy. He assumes the internal dependency of the Malagasy on their colonizers. The French recommended is, quote, the painful apprenticeships to freedom, end quote, to the people whose psyche is thought to be undeveloped. Granting complete independency is said to be out of the question and contrary to psychological imperatives. Quote, we might as well ask Caliban and Prosario to meet on equal footing. Expect Prosperio to behave as Caliban's guests, or Caliban to treat him like one. Quote, an impossibility, perfectly obvious to Monone. What is more, any Malagasy hopes for freedom and, quote, complete personality requires the kind of deliverance and magnanimity of the colonizer, quote, in trying to deliver the Malagasy from his dependence. We should be leading him along the rocky road of inferiority, end quote. Then and only then could the colonized, a human and an adult like us. And at the end, Monone rationalized and defended colonialism. This is what Fanon attacks, as we have seen in chapter 5. And we'll stop there because we're going to go to Fanon's master and slave dialectic. So Monone is an asshole. Same thing.
I noticed that, like, people are like, there's not racism in medical history, and this is like straight up racism in psychological history. And it's not like the history was that long ago. This was in the 60s and 70s. That's not that long. I was born in the 70s. It's not that long ago.
Yeah.
What page are we on?
Yeah. 128.
Also, Fanon had a lot of work cut out in front of him, having to fight this and come out and say, hey, this is all BS.
Yeah. He really is trying to get the dialectics of like a materialist reading and stuff. Because I'm like Fanon, like these people come up with these bullshit antics based on like bullshit things. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
I don't know.
they just made it up. They were like, these people are nice. They want to be oppressed.
Yeah, but like the master slave dialectic, it's still in formation. It still can be negated to like even to like owners, capitalists, and workers. It can be colonized to the colonizer, master to the slave. You know what I mean?
Yes,
So
I do.
it transforms. All right. Does anybody else have anything that they want to come up or say anything? Because tomorrow we'll be doing Fanon's master and slave dialectic. We'll see what he says. It looks like it.
That's better.
Well, the first part was good. This talking about general what the master slave dialectic is about. That was good. That was insightful. But these other people, like their interpretation, it seems to be a little off. Seems to be off. You know. So we'll find out what Fanon takes away from it and what he does. You know. Tomorrow. Is there anything else before I let it go for the night?
Love you, bye.
All right. Anybody?